And joining me now is the Congress MP from Thiruvananthapuram, someone who's had a wide experience in international diplomacy, also been a Minister of State for External Affairs. Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much for joining me here on India Today. Let's get your stand, Dr. Tharoor, clear. The Prime Minister today has tweeted a little while ago, I thank Prime Minister Netanyahu for his phone call and providing an update on the ongoing situation. People of India stand firmly with Israel in this difficult hour. India strongly and unequivocally condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Is that a stand you also support unequivocally?
Yes, but it's not the whole picture. In other words, we do absolutely stand with Israel when they're being attacked in such a horrendous way and civilians are being killed. But we also do take the broader view in mind, Rajdeep. Our traditional position has always been that both Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in security and dignity behind safe borders in their own lands. And the fact that in the case of the Palestinians, they've been suffering a dehumanizing occupation for a very long time, and that for 75 years there has been no durable solution to their plight, despite many attempts by the UN, by various states to try and get a solution. That, I think, remains a matter of great concern. So we don't want to lose sight of that. In other words, we want the Palestinian people to have decent, secure lives. We want the Israeli people to have decent, secure lives. We condemn terrorism, but at the same time, we don't want to see a situation in which the Palestinians feel they have no recourse but to resort to violence. There's a peace process which has been stagnating for many years. And I think that this is something that have to be looked at as a whole, Rajdeep. The immediate situation, yes, Israel and Israeli civilians are being grotesquely treated. There's really been brutal assaults on innocent, ordinary people who are not soldiers or fighters. And I think that's terrorism by any yardstick, and we can't accept that. And I think India is absolutely justified in standing with Israel. But in the bigger picture, we also stand with the Palestinian people, and we want to see the Palestinian people obtain their rights to decent lives as an independent state.
The reason I asked you this is because the Congress Working Committee, of which you are a part, as part of their resolution yesterday, stated or reaffirmed their support for the Palestinian cause, for a Palestinian state and a peaceful resolution to the issue, but refused to explicitly condemn Hamas or the terrorism emanating from the Hamas. So you're saying that you see what's happened in Israel as terrorism, but your own party refrained from using the words Hamas or terrorism. And that leads some to believe that the Congress hasn't gone far enough in condemning the acts that have been perpetrated on innocent civilians.
First of all, there was an official statement by the Congress party the previous day, which was broadly along the lines that I have just responded to, because I myself had issued a tweet at about the same time in which I made precisely this point. So I think for many of us, the position is indeed a balanced one. We're not suggesting that there can be any sort of two-sidedness to terror. There is no excuse for terror. But at the same time, we cannot possibly be thrilled about the long period of injustice to the Palestinian people as well. And that's why I think finding a decent...
But do you explicitly condemn Hamas? Do you explicitly condemn Hamas, Dr. Tharoor? Do you explicitly condemn Hamas and see it as a terrorist organization?
Well, the terrorist organization label is one we're very careful not to follow other countries' leads in these matters. The US considers Hamas a terrorist organization, so does Israel. India has not made any such classification, and I'm going to stick to the Indian position that these are terrorist acts. But to call everybody in Hamas, there are political elements of Hamas who one day we may have to negotiate with, or the Israelis may have to negotiate with. So let me just say these are terrorist acts. There's never any excuse for terrorism. India must condemn it unreservedly, and I agree with the government that they condemned it and they stood with the victims of terror. But we want to lose sight at the same time of the fact that the Palestinians also have rights, and those rights have been systematically violated over a long period of time. Let me say also, when you ask about the Congress position, that there will be more detailed positions. The resolution focused overwhelmingly on domestic affairs, and language that got into the resolution essentially as an afterthought is to remind people of our long-standing commitment to the Palestinian people. But the larger, broader, more nuanced picture will surely emerge in future statements. This problem, sadly, is not going to end in a day or two. And nor should we take any one statement as the total picture or the last word on the subject. We are all aware that there is terrible wrong that's been civilians by Hamas, and that cannot be condoned. And we are seeing images of terrible destruction and killing on the other side. There are civilians dying in Gaza as well. There are journalists who've been killed in Gaza. There's terrible stuff happening on both sides of the border. And now, just as I was waiting to talk to you, I hear your reporter saying that Hezbollah may have been trying to cross the border from Lebanon, which means we're talking about potentially a much wider and more serious war. This is at a time when, in fact, the region seemed to be heading towards peace, where the Arab countries had made their peace with Israel, the so-called Abraham Accords, which brought the UAE in. You know, India itself was part of the so-called I2U2, which was India and the UAE joining with the Americans and the Israelis in collective dialogue. On top of that, there were very strong reports of the Saudis making peace with the Israelis. That, of course, is now on hold, and some say that perhaps Hamas was really targeting that. But the point is that it's sad and tragic when people who are beginning to get used to the idea of living in peace are suddenly confronted once again by war. War never solves anything. I was with Kofi Annan when we met the Israeli foreign minister nearly 20 years ago, and he informed us of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza at that time, after a long occupation of Gaza. Now, the Israelis are marching back into Gaza, and undoubtedly they have superior strength, and they will probably be once again in occupation of Gaza. And I have no doubt that the situation will not be any different. They will again, at some point, feel they have to cut their losses and leave, because this cycle will keep repeating itself until you have a durable solution. And that is, frankly, what is really needed, what India has been calling for.
What is that? No, but as you said, when you were in the United Nations, there have been efforts made on this for decades. What, according to you, is a solution? And given the scale of the attacks, the audacity of it, the possibility that other countries, especially Iran, Lebanon, the Hezbollah in particular, could be involved, suggests that we could be heading towards a wider war, which makes peace even more difficult. What is that solution that you see happening? I mean, is this the intractable problem of the 21st century?
Well, it seemed that way for 75 years, but in fact, the outlines of a solution have been clear for more than 3 decades. And the solutions are very simple. 2 states living side by side in peace and security with clearly defined borders, and at the same time with some international guarantees that one will not attack the other. And for this, you need to have responsible and moderate leadership on both sides. The Palestinian Authority did have that leadership, and they did not find an adequate response on the Israeli side. The Israelis under Netanyahu have continued a settlement building, for example, in the occupied territories in the West Bank in particular, which undoubtedly prolonged an occupation that could have been ended with a recognition of a Palestinian state, which still hasn't happened. The formula of 2 states with secure borders for both peoples is the only formula that can solve the problem. But increasingly, actions on the ground are making the 2-state solution more and more unviable. It was getting more unviable as Israeli settlements were spreading across the occupied territory, so there would have been no real room for a Palestinian state. Now it's getting unviable with the attacks from Gaza into Israel, and now Israel's counterattack. Now, if you say Hezbollah has crossed the border, which I had not yet seen until I heard it on your show, then Hezbollah will drag in undoubtedly some elements of southern Lebanon, and also possibly, since both Hezbollah and Hamas are backed by Iran, Iran might also become a target. The whole thing becomes incredibly worrying. Americans have, I gather, sent a ship already to Israel, a destroyer, and there's going to be more such international involvement as well. We don't want another wide war. India has always stood for peace in that region.
You know, but in conclusion, Dr. Tharoor, you're saying India has always stood for peace. India also, particularly in recent times, has seen Israel as an all-weather ally, someone with whom we have closer defense cooperation, we have closer partnerships, strategic partnerships emerging. To that extent, would you say that this policy of neutrality that we had towards supporting the Palestinian cause and yet having relations with Israel, that's gone. There's a very special relationship that exists today between India and Israel, and at some level between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yeah, but you can't personalize these matters. Yes, I think it's important that our prime minister, maintains good links with other prime ministers. I think that's a human thing, and that's always welcome and valuable. But ultimately, national interests trump personal chemistry. And the national interest of India is in seeing that all sides get a fair deal out of this. Yes, Israel has been an invaluable partner, particularly on strategic security matters. They've also been good people-to-people relations. We have, in fact, Indian civilians right now in Israel, one of whom was injured in the rocket attacks from Gaza, and others who are in danger. And we would like very much that Israel look after the security of our citizens in their country as well. So we have a valued relationship with Israel, but at the same time, we have historically stood for justice for the Palestinian people as well. And I don't think it would be right for us to back away from that. So let us make sure that we, in condemning terrorism, don't lose sight of the bigger picture affecting the Palestinians. That is a serious matter, and it's something which goes right back to the days of Mahatma Gandhi before independence, when he took a stand on the idea of a proposed Jewish state. And I must say that for us, that decent, where both sides are right, both sides deserve the best kind of approach, is the right thing for India. There is no reason for India to be unilaterally condemning either the Palestinians or the Israelis. We can condemn terrorist actions, but then we should equally be concerned about the denial of long-term rights of the Palestinians, and equally be concerned about the death, devastation, and destruction being visited right now upon the Palestinians as part of the Israeli retaliation. No one is accusing the Israelis of having started this. It's started by Hamas, but their retaliation, including the siege of Gaza, where they've cut off water, electricity, fuel, essential supplies into a strip of land that otherwise can't be provisioned, is actually a pretty dangerous step in humanitarian terms. So I don't think that it's a pure black and white situation, Razi.
Okay, let's leave it there. It's a more nuanced position that you've taken, and one perhaps that needs to be supported across political lines, that while you condemn Hamas and the terror that has taken place against innocent civilians, you've also got to be conscious about the dehumanizing that's taken place over the years of the Palestinian people. Appreciate your joining us, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Razi.
I'm joined by BJP MP, former Minister Jayant Sinha joins me. Appreciate your joining us, Mr. Sinha. I want to get a sense of how you at the BJP and the government sees what's happening at the moment in Gaza and Israel. Are you very clear, as the Prime Minister says, terrorism in all its manifestations and forms must be condemned, must be rejected, and therefore the Hamas must be seen in this instance as the principal villain of the peace?
Rajdeep, very good evening to you. The Honorable Prime Minister has been very forthright and clear in articulating India's position, which has been consistent now throughout our government, which is that we condemn terrorism in all forms, that we have said, and the Honorable Prime Minister has become very well known for having said it, that this is not the era, the age for war. That we have to follow the UN Charter, that we have to ensure that all disputes and issues are resolved peacefully and through mediation. This kind of an unprecedented assault on innocent civilians and the death of more than 900 Israeli civilians through these brutal attacks is terrorism and is not acceptable in a civilized world. If there are issues, if there are challenges, there are channels, there are mechanisms for communication, for discussion, where these issues can be resolved and dealt with. But we cannot have, in today's very volatile and turbulent global geopolitical situation, these kinds of very terrible and very, very destructive and brutal attacks, particularly on civilians.
But what is very interesting is the Prime Minister was very quick to offer support to Israel. On the other hand, there is very little mention, if any at all, of the Palestinian state or our traditional support to the idea of the Palestinian state. So while the Congress is being accused of not mentioning Hamas explicitly in its CWC resolution. The BJP has been extremely silent when it comes to the sufferings of the Palestinian people.
Rajdeep, we have to first deal with an act of terrorism, which is what we are confronting right now. Once these hostilities cease, once the terrorism stops, once this kind of, frankly, cross-border terrorism stops, then we can discuss legitimate demands on both sides. But these cannot be done in this environment of hostility and this kind of unprecedented attack on innocent civilians. India, as you know, has been the victim of these kinds of attacks on innocent civilians as well. We remember them all too well, unfortunately. And you don't negotiate at gunpoint. It's not possible to have any kind of discussion or any kind of negotiation when these kinds of hostilities and these kinds of cross-border terrorist acts are being undertaken.
But it almost seems as if the BJP is very clear, Israel is our all-weather friend and ally, and therefore we will stand with Israel. To that extent, that seems a slight departure from the past when the Congress was in power, when their first reaction would be to emphasize or reaffirm their support for a Palestinian state. For example, the BJP tweeted on the 7th of October, what Israel is facing today, India suffered between 2004 and 14. Never forgive, never forget. So am I right in suggesting that the BJP is very clear, we will put our weight behind Israel at a moment like this?
Rajdeep, we are against cross-border terrorism. We are against targeting innocent civilians. We are against these kinds of unprovoked hostilities. And clearly, Israel is suffering from that right now. Israel is a victim of this right now. And whether it is Israel in this particular instance or whether it was the 9/11 attack on the United States, we have always condemned and always come in support of those that are suffering from cross-border terrorism because we have suffered from it so extensively. Now, that being said, we have friends across the Middle East. We have good relationships with all of the players in the Middle East. As you know, right now, there has been a very serious discussion ongoing between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is another country with which we have very friendly relations, to be able to come up with an accord which will further stabilize the Middle East. We also have very good relationships with other players in the Middle East, such as Iran. And so our goal across all of these different relationships and all that's happening in the Middle East is to ensure stability, is to ensure peace. And again, as the Honorable Prime Minister said, this is not the era for war. This is the era for stable relationships between countries, for democracy, for freedom, and for prosperity. We are already globally facing many, many serious challenges, like, of course, the issues that we are dealing with respect to climate change, the pandemic that we've just dealt with, the debt crisis that many countries are dealing with right now. So under these circumstances, with all these global challenges, to in a completely, brutal way to establish this kind of a cross-border terrorist act is really not what the world needs right now.
But how concerned should we be, given that this Israel-Hamas war comes less than a month after India, along with the US, Saudi Arabia, UAE, France, Germany, Italy, European Union had announced an ambitious India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor during the G20 summit. Is this a huge setback? And is that a concern? Even the Saudis at the moment aren't openly willing in a way to support Israel. So will that be a huge setback to this idea of this ambitious corridor?
We need economic stability. We need good relationships with all the players in the Middle East so that game-changing initiatives like this Middle Eastern Economic Corridor can be initiated for the sustainable prosperity of all of the countries associated with this. This is precisely why this is not the era for war. This is the era for cooperation. This is the era for trade. This is the era for economic growth and ensuring prosperity for all people. If we can collaborate in that fashion and if we can work together, then we can help everyone. The Israelis, the Palestinians, the Saudis, the Iranians, everybody will benefit from these kinds of cooperative and collaborative arrangements, which is exactly what we have tried to do through our continued still via presidents of the whole G20 process. And Vasudev Kutumbakam was actually our slogan through the entire G20, and it tells you very clearly what our approach is, which is one earth, one family, one future. That's really what we are working to achieve.
In conclusion, I get a sense that at one level there's this diplomatic tightrope walk, given the fact that we have strong relationships with moderate Gulf states. At the same time, we have a strong relationship now with Israel. There's a personal chemistry, it appears, between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And many are saying Prime Minister Netanyahu, we put all our eggs in his basket, and he finds himself under pressure after these terror attacks. How much of this is this, therefore, diplomatic tightrope walk that India will have to do in the months ahead?
The Honorable Prime Minister and, of course, the Honorable Foreign Minister and the National Security Advisor have very good relationships with everybody in the Middle East. The Honorable Prime Minister has been awarded the highest honor that can be received in the UAE, in Egypt, and many other countries in the Middle East. So he is very well respected. He's very well regarded across the Middle East. And that enables India to be able to put together initiatives like the Middle Eastern Economic Corridor.